World building. It's one of the many hallmarks of a successful fictional world. It's not necessary by any means, but I'm somebody who can really appreciate devs who put in the time to make sure that they do proper, good world building. I want to feel like the world that I am playing in is actually inhabited and that the people living in it, whether they're important or not, are actually people who live there, that these people actually experience what's going on in this world. I want to feel like the NPCs walking down the street could be a feasible real person. So naturally, this means that I am drawn to small details that, in the grand scheme of things, do not really matter. If I can piece together stories in the background or put together what the economics or politics of this fictional world is without it ever coming up in the main story, you've got a good case in my book. And the Rockstar team is no stranger to adding really minute details. They are very good at fleshing out the world that their characters live in. And that is especially true in the world of Red Dead Redemption 2. There are countless little details that make this world feel alive and realistic and really truly inhabited, and there is just not enough time in the day for me to get to all of the things that make that true. So for today, I want to take a look at the newspapers that you can find within the world of Red Dead Redemption 2 and what that tells us about the world that the characters live in. Obligatory preface, because I know somebody is going to say something if I don't say this. I am aware that the newspaper's only function is to recap the main story as it happens. It serves the same function as the radio station in all of the GTA games. They're really only there to help the player track the progress of the main story. I am not criticizing this game for not having some super in-depth, super detailed newspaper function with hours poured into every individual issue and differences amongst the different towns and differences depending on population. I don't need all of that. My enjoyment of this game is not dependent on some paper, and yours shouldn't be either. I just want to have some fun and pick apart little details that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, because that's what I do, okay? Okay. And speaking of little details that don't really matter, the first thing that I want to talk about is where you can find the newspapers in Red Dead Redemption 2. There are 3 separate newspapers that are based on location. The New Hanover Gazette can be found in, you guessed it, New Hanover, in either Valentine or Annesburg. The Blackwater Ledger can be found in the state of West Elizabeth in either Strawberry or, you guessed it, Blackwater. And the Saint Denis Times-Tribune can be found in the state of Lemoyne, either in Rhodes and, can you take a wild guess, Saint Denis. Now, the keenest of minds might realize that when you look at a map of Red Dead Redemption 2, there are actually 5 states that make up its open world, and the entirety of the United States of America is implied to be out of bounds. And despite that, there are only 3 newspapers. And despite these towns being light years away from each other, some of them actually share the same publication. Now, obviously, I understand that this was probably just the easiest way to set up the newspaper system in this game, but if you will allow me to indulge a little bit and read far too deep into something that isn't very deep, I think that there is an argument to be made that having only 3 newspapers and 2 of the states lacking their own paper actually adds to the world building of Red Dead Redemption 2. For starters, let's talk about the states that don't even have their own paper: Ambarino and New Austin. Ambarino, as we see it in the second game, is an incredibly sparse state with almost no inhabitants and pretty much no civilization. And while Coulter, the small mining town up north, did exist at one point, and it wasn't entirely unheard of for mining towns to have their own newspaper, we don't know how long this town has been abandoned by the time our protagonists come across it at the beginning of the story. It's hard to say when this little town last saw any activity, let alone if it even had a paper in the first place. My point is, though, there is no need for Ambarino to have a paper. There is nothing to report on because almost nobody lives here. That makes plenty enough sense to me. In New Austin's case, though, I really don't have a lot to say in defense of New Austin's lack of newspaper. The only reason I could possibly fathom is that the distance between Armadillo and Tumbleweed, which are already pretty sparse, pretty small towns to begin with, they just don't really need a paper, which I also find pretty improbable when we consider that small towns like Valentine and Strawberry, that are comparable in size, are distributing their own papers. Unfortunately, I do quite honestly just have to chalk this up to the very undeveloped New Austin that we get in the second game, mainly because in the first game, the Blackwater Ledger is available to purchase throughout all of New Austin and even down in Mexico. So yeah, it is kind of lame that they don't get their own thing. I don't know if the assumption here is meant to be that within the time of the epilogue in the second game and the events of the first game that Blackwater has developed much more and distributed their papers even further down to these southern states. But quite honestly, I don't think it makes a lot of sense that towns like Tumbleweed and Armadillo would be dependent on Blackwater's newspaper. Sure, I understand saying that they probably don't have the manpower for their own publications, but Blackwater, Tumbleweed, and Armadillo are such different places with different socio-political goings-on, with different terrain, and they draw in different people. I just can't see small towns in New Austin giving a single shit about what's being reported up in Blackwater. So unfortunately, I don't really have a world building explanation for this one. I do just kind of have some criticism on the devs for, again, giving us a very underdeveloped New Austin. Not that, a newspaper function would fix all of the problems that I have with it, but at least it would be something, I guess. But anyway, let's get back on topic and talk about the states that actually do have their own papers. In the state of Lemoyne, both Rhodes and Saint Denis distribute the same paper, the Saint Denis Times Tribune. Despite the distance between the two towns and the big geographical difference between where Rhodes is located and where Saint Denis is located, I actually find this a pretty plausible scenario. Saint Denis is an expansive and ever-growing city, and it is a powerhouse in terms of development, of cultural diversity, and of course, everyone's favorite, capitalism, especially in the context of the game's world in which Saint Denis is the biggest and, again, most developed city that we can come across. In fact, it's the only city we can come across. Rhodes, on the other hand, Rhodes is stuck in the past, let's just say. Not only is it a fraction of Saint Denis' size, but this small town is haunted by its history and this interminable feud going on between these two big plantation families. The Scarlet Meadows region of Lemoyne holds the remnants of war in this really unforgivable territory that doesn't really lend its way for a lot of economic growth and development. Whether it's economically or socially, Rhodes just doesn't really have the ability to move on and grow. It makes sense that a small town like this just wouldn't have the ability to sustain its own paper. Instead, it's easiest to just let Saint Denis create it and then ship in whatever it is they print and hand it out to the residents. That's really the only option these people have if they want to stay up to date on national or statewide news. Having to hear about whatever bullshit's going on in Saint Denis is a small price to pay if you want to make sure you're keeping up to date on what the president's doing. All that is to say, the two towns in Lemoyne sharing the same paper makes a lot of sense to me. I can believe, in the context of this world, that the publisher in Saint Denis is distributing to the people of Rhodes. Given what we know about these towns, given what we can infer about their economic states, it's a very plausible scenario. But I do in fact have a few more hesitations when it comes to the Blackwater Ledger. Rather, I just have a few questions. Now, to be fair, I can believe that a town like Strawberry would be dependent on a paper that is written, published, and distributed in another town. Despite the mayor's attempts to portray this as some sort of luxurious tourist town, it most certainly is not. It's very small, and not only that, but it is located in the middle of nowhere. The closest civilization to Strawberry is the logging company up north and the nearest train station. They don't have a diverse population, but then again, the population is pretty small anyways. I can imagine that not much news goes on here. In fact, I'd say that the lack of a local paper is just another sign that this town is much more underdeveloped than the mayor wants to admit. So, sure, on paper, no pun intended, I could believe that a bigger town like Blackwater might have to supplement papers to Strawberry to make sure that everybody stays up to date on what's going on. Maybe even temporarily until a town like that can sort of get up on its own feet and take over their own publication. The only thing that turns me off of that possibility is the location of these two towns. Blackwater is in the Great Plains region of West Elizabeth, and it's separated from the Big Valley region by the Upper Montana River. It is the same state, yes, but it is a very different region. Blackwater is a developing town that is really trying to make its mark on this lower half of West Elizabeth. But then again, maybe that's the point. Maybe Blackwater distributing their paper all the way up north to a town like Strawberry is a way to showcase their economic growth. Blackwater has all of the facilities to make and print a paper, while conversely, Strawberry is so early on in its development that it's sort of forced to depend on the one other town in the state that actually has the facilities. Now, realistically, I know and understand that that's not at all the reason why. It's not that deep, but it is an interesting thought. But if we do want to talk about what is unrealistic, then who boy does the New Hanover Gazette take that cake. First things first, we don't even know where the New Hanover Gazette is produced and distributed from. So I already have a huge problem there, not knowing where the hell this paper is being made at. But even if we did know, I still don't think that that would really explain why in the world Valentine and Annesburg are depending on the same paper. Valentine is a small cattle town situated in the middle of New Hanover's heartlands, and Annesburg is a mining town that is situated all the way up in the Roanoke Ridge region. I just find it so hard to believe that these two towns are reading the same paper. I could suspend some disbelief between the distance of Strawberry and Blackwater because of what it implied about their economic states. But with these two, quite honestly, the only similarity between these two towns is the fact that they're in the same state. Economically, socially, there's just no similarities there. News about the Murphy brood does not matter out in Valentine, and news about the cattle trade does not matter all the way in Annesburg. The only real credit I can give this is the fact that it solidifies this idea that these two towns maybe aren't economically stable enough to produce their own paper. Now, mining towns were known to produce their own papers. It wouldn't be unheard of for a town like Annesburg to have its own local news up and running. But I can also believe that the people of Annesburg are so overworked and restricted to only working in the mine that there just isn't the manpower to support that. And while Valentine might seem economically sound enough to actually support its own publication, we also have to remember that Valentine is said to house a lot of vagrants and people that are just passing through. Either they wouldn't have the money, they wouldn't have the time, or they don't live there, so it doesn't matter. I really just wish that we had the slightest clue about where this paper comes from, because even that I think would help a little bit in trying to determine something. Maybe that would give us a little more insight on the logistics and economics. I will in fact allow you to say, hey Jay, you're reading a little bit too deep into this, because this time I am in fact inclined to agree. I really don't think there's any explanation outside of, we needed a paper, there it is. We don't know where it comes from, don't worry about it. You are right, it is hashtag not that deep. I will agree with you just this once. Say it now while you can. But now that we've discussed the location of these papers and what that might tell us about the world, I want to talk about the actual format. First of all, I find the fact that the New Hanover Gazette is the only newspaper to list its volume in the Hindu Arabic numerals instead of Roman numerals a deliberate attempt to showcase the difference in audience. I think it's fair to say that the residents of Valentine and Annesburg don't care as much about aesthetics as, say, the high society of Saint Denis or the traveling tourists of Blackwater. But the real detail here lies in the number of issues and volumes. Yes, a detail as small as how many of these were printed does tell us something. It gives us a little insight to the publishers and the history of these towns, believe it or not. For example, let's look at the very first newspaper issue available to purchase in-game. This issue can be purchased after the mission Eastward Bound, aka the mission in which Arthur and the gang relocate to New Hanover, also known as the mission that gives you free will. As soon as you are granted access into the open world, you can go and buy yourself your very own newspaper. In New Hanover, either in Valentine or Annesburg, this first issue is listed as issue number 27, and if you look at the description of the item, it's listed as volume 17. If you go to West Elizabeth, this issue of the Blackwater Ledger is number 62, volume 98. And if you decide to venture all the way out to Saint Denis or Rhodes, you'll find the Saint Denis Times-Tribune issue number 43, volume 67. Do not laugh at that. So, like, why does that matter? Well, in my extremely limited knowledge of how newspapers work, issues typically refer to the daily releases, whereas volumes typically refer to the yearly releases of the paper. So a new issue is published every day, and a new volume is released at the beginning of every year, typically. Sometimes issues can vary, and they might release weekly or even monthly depending on the context of the paper or the audience reading it. And sometimes volumes can occur more frequently, being semi-annually or quarterly. It really really just depends on what the hell your paper's about. But with all of that in mind, I think we have enough reasonable context to say that the newspapers in Red Dead Redemption 2 are not being released daily. Not only would that be an absolute nightmare to code, but it makes the most sense to have articles reporting on what's happened in the story after there's been a real impact. And given the fact that we only see new issues release every few missions, there's typically only like 1 to 3 issues per chapter. It seems to me as if the implication here is that these issues release on a weekly basis. And that's sort of assuming the most frequently. Now, the only problem we run into with that assumption is thanks to the sign on the headquarters of the Blackwater Ledger. This sign states that new issues are released every Monday and Friday. Now, since all 3 of these publishers release their new issues at the same time, are we meant to assume that they all publish every Monday and Friday? Maybe. I could maybe believe that towns like Saint Denis or Blackwater might have enough local news going on that could justify publishing a new issue every Monday and Friday. There is an argument to be made there, but I am not hearing it for the New Hanover Gazette. They are not publishing 2 times a week. But this sign does confirm for us that there are not issues releasing every single day. It's just that the implications that it has for our timeline don't really make a lot of sense. Now, of course, obviously it is very difficult to determine a sort of canon timeline, considering we as the player can take literal years between missions if we really wanted to. But I'm sorry, I just find it really hard to believe that the supposed canon timeline here is that there are only 5 days between the time that Arthur and John steal some sheep and Arthur and Trelawney rob that opera singer. That is not 5 days, you just can't tell me that. If you want to, you can absolutely believe that this is supplementing a sort of canon timeline, that's up to you, but I am not buying it. I am not convinced. This was just another oversight. They just wanted to put something on the Blackwater Ledger headquarters sign, and that's what they came up with. And speaking of possible oversights, with these numbers, we are meant to assume that the Blackwater Ledger has been posting the longest out of these 3 publications. This tells us that the Blackwater Ledger has been around for almost 5 times longer than the New Hanover Gazette and over 30 years longer than the Saint Denis Times-Tribune. That is bullshit. Just looking at the size of both Saint Denis and Blackwater should tell you that Saint Denis has been around for a very long time, and certainly longer than Blackwater. But thanks to the city's crest, we can actually run with the knowledge that Saint Denis was founded in 1720. Conversely, Blackwater was said to be founded in 1767. A 40-year time difference, especially in the 1700s, is not nothing. Now everybody give a round of applause for Arthur for cataloging everything in his life, because if we take a look at his journal, he has an entry written before the events of the game as we sort of take over and get involved in his life, where he writes about Hosea and Dutch's previous time in Blackwater. And unless these 2 men visited Blackwater over 100 years ago, we can safely say that Blackwater was nothing more than a trading post not that long ago. Now, perhaps the easiest assumption to make here is just that Saint Denis was a little bit late to the newspaper game and didn't quite get a head start on it like Blackwater did. But that is also, most likely, bullshit. Thanks to the subheading on Saint Denis Times-Tribune's papers, we know that they started publishing in 1832. And considering in 1899 we see that the Saint Denis Times-Tribune is on volume number 67, that tells us that this paper is releasing its volumes yearly. So what's the deal then? Well, maybe Blackwater just publishes its volumes a little more frequently, you know? Maybe they have semi-annual or quarterly releases instead of yearly, is what I would say if it wasn't for the fact that it's also confirmed that Blackwater releases its publications yearly, as does the New Hanover Gazette. All 3 of them do. Between 1899 and 1907, we see the jump in volume numbers increase by 8 years. The New Hanover Gazette goes from volume 17 to volume 25, the Blackwater Ledger goes from volume 98 to volume 106, and the Saint Denis Times-Tribune goes from volume 67 to volume 75. So then what the hell is the explanation? It was another oversight, most likely. The big takeaway here is really just that the volumes and issues in this game don't make a lot of sense. The last issue published in Chapter 4 and the first issue published in Chapter 5 after the gang returns from Guarma only increases by 1. And now, look, I'm no maritime expert. I don't quite know how long it takes to travel by boat, but I do think it's fair to assume that the whole Guarma arc took longer than 5 days. They didn't leave on a Monday and come back by Friday, I can tell you that. Even when we do get to the epilogue and the volumes skip ahead by 8, the issues still only increase by 1 incrementally. unfortunately. Now, that's either an insane coincidence or the devs just made it that way because it was the easiest. Listen, I fully understand that Rockstar did not put as much thought into this as I am right now because, let's be honest, why would they? Why would anybody care? They probably just assigned random numbers and they called it a day, and that's fine. I don't need Rockstar to spend a ton of time figuring out the exact number and doing the math to calculate how many volumes and issues should have been released depending on, when these towns were founded or what their audience is. There are 1,000 better places for these people to have put their time. In fact, I feel as though one of the places where their attention to detail did pay off is in the actual contents of the newspapers. Which, to be fair, the words are the main point of these, not the volumes and issues. I would make an argument, and in fact, I would say I have. Pretty much everything written in these papers can be used as a way to expand the world of Red Dead Redemption 2. Perhaps the most unbelievable part of the written contents themselves would just be the fact that 3 different publishers in 3 separate states have all just happened to publish an identical newspaper. But can I just say that in the context of making this video, I am actually eternally grateful that all of these issues are identical. It has saved me from having to pick apart 42 different issues and the contents of 42 different issues. And listen, I would love to have an explanation for why I think these 3 publishers have all put out the exact same paper and really delve into what the implications of that are, but I don't have one. Maybe you could theorize some kind of early stage capitalist conglomerate manufacturing these papers and distributing them out to these 3 states to sort of sink their claws into a monopoly of newspapers, but I have a feeling that it quite literally is just because it was easiest for devs to do. And I do not blame them for that. Believe me, I would not want to sit there and put time and energy into making 42 incredibly unique newspapers that are dependent on location and audience, especially since their primary purpose is simply to just report on the main story of the game. Before we get into the main story and how it's represented, I want to talk about the side columns and smaller articles and what those imply about the world. Now, in reference to our main story, there's actually a few articles in these papers that foreshadow the events that our protagonists go through. And it's never anything in your face or obnoxiously loud and obvious. If you read these in your first playthrough, there's a great chance that you'll have no idea what's foreshadowing and what isn't, because they all read the same. It simply just points out events that are happening in the world. We're told of strangers and what they're doing before we ever come across them. Multiple articles warn readers about gangs causing conflict, typically right before they become a problem for our protagonists in the main story. Once we get into chapter 4, there's multiple reports about the goings-on in Saint Denis before we ever get involved. In the epilogue, there's even references to characters from the first game long before they ever cross paths with John Marston. Sure, these characters and events do involve our protagonists at some point, but having these little articles about them and their lives outside of the perception of the protagonists helps them feel a little bit more real and actually lived in the world. It helps them feel a little more fleshed out and like they actually live in this world, not like they only exist for conflict with the main story. And speaking of the epilogue, within those 4 issues published in that time, there's actually some articles that help round up some smaller storylines. You know that supposed oil below the Wapiti reservation that resulted in the Native Americans being tortured, bullied, harassed, kidnapped, targeted by the government and army, hate crimed, and chased off over? Yeah, it didn't exist. Never existed. Was never there. And as unfortunate as this news is, it does help this storyline come to a culmination, and hearing about it in the news long after it occurs does make it feel more real. Those oil tycoons did try, and they failed miserably, and an entire group of people suffered because of it. Many such cases, unfortunately. In lighter news, though, we do actually get a few updates about some of our ex-gangmates in these pages. Without this article, we wouldn't have had a single clue about what happened to Reverend Swanson after he left the gang in Chapter 6. His personal redemption arc hits this payoff knowing that he was so successful afterwards, and that leaving the gang and sobering up came to a head in a way that brought him more joy and probably satisfaction than sticking with the gang ever would have. And even though we get to see Mary Beth in the epilogue and actually hear about her success directly from her, it's another thing entirely to read about her success, or, well, Leslie DuPont's success in the paper. It's one thing for her to just tell us, oh yeah, my books are really successful and now I'm rich and acclaimed and famous for it. But it's another thing entirely to actually read it in the paper and hear about what audience reactions are and know how critics feel. That makes it feel so much more real and actually enveloped in the world. And perhaps one of the most relieving things to read in these pages actually comes in an article reporting on the popularity of golf, of all things. Not because golf matters in any way, but because this report tells us that one Edith Downs has opened a very successful golf course out in California. And not only that, but she and her son have been very successful venturing into multiple businesses out west. Getting this closure with the Downs family and knowing that they moved on from their grief and they were able to turn their lives around and become really successful is such a satisfying thing to read. And if it wasn't for this paper, we wouldn't have known that. But what about all these other articles that don't directly relate to the main story and report on the characters that we know? Well, they still do plenty to help expand the world. We can read multiple articles about the economics and politics as they exist in the background. And aside from his cigarette card, this is the only real information that we get about President McAllister. It's the only real insight we get to what his policies and his beliefs are, which are interesting, to say the least. It's also the only real insight we get into how the president's choices are impacting the citizens of America. We also see reports about the economics of Wall Street and what the state of New York is like in this point in time. Again, hearing about these out-of-state events and all of these things going on outside of the map we are confined to helps this world feel more lived in. It helps it feel like the choices that someone like the president or some kind of war going out in a different country actually has impact on the people that we come across. Perhaps the most frequent economic updates that we see, though, are those of railroads. Like, there's a lot of articles about railroad development, and although those weren't the most fun articles to read, it is helpful to know what's going on because of the impact that these railroads have on economics and the sort of socio-political implications of the railroad development in the region. Railroads are transportation. They deliver goods. They have an impact on the economy and the lives of people who live in these towns. And speaking of development, there's actually quite a few articles in these papers about inventions that are occurring at this time as well. Not only is this a reminder of this turn of the century that we are witnessing these characters live through, but it helps relate this world to ours. A few of the reports in here, such as one about a submarine and some steam-powered flying machine, reference or symbolize actual real-world developments and inventions. And even though we don't get to interact with any of these inventions ourselves, we don't get to see anybody test out the first ever refrigerator, it is nice to know that the world these characters are living in is constantly changing and developing technologically. We can also read about a few points of interest that we can actually come across in the world. Reports talking about a meteor shower in Roanoke Ridge, about a large face motif carved in a cliffside in Amberino, and a rather sad plea on the missing Blackwater athletics team. And there's also local news that gives us a little bit more insight into the average lives of these NPCs. Apparently, the citizens of Valentine have a boiling hatred for the Chelonians, and residents of the bayou are terrorized by a group of people they refer to as the Night Folk. There's random articles that talk about people and characters and these events that we never get to witness in game. There's an entire article in the 7th issue about a guy named T.K. Langingham. I don't know if that's how you say that. Sorry, bro. Telling us about this guy and his missing cows. That's it. That's the entire article. This dude's missing his cows and he's upset about it. A lot of these are really, truly pointless in the grand scheme of things. There's nothing we can really do with them outside of just put together these lives of these NPCs in the background. And I love it. I love feeling like I can get to know the people who live in the background and the people who go about their daily lives and we never interact with. I like feeling like I can know what the opinions and thoughts of the citizens of a town is. I don't need to, but I like having the option. Again, I keep saying it, but it helps make this world feel like it's really real and like the NPCs aren't just NPCs. Okay, now that we've gotten all of this filler and the little small articles out of the way, I think it's time we delve into the main course and talk about how the main story is represented in the newspapers. Now, because these are reports that are detailing events that we as the player actually have a hand in committing, oftentimes we aren't fed new information that we don't already know. know. The law and whatever reporters type these articles up don't have as much detail and context as we do. But these articles do still give us a little bit of insight into how the general public is impacted by the actions of the gang. It allows us to think about the consequences of the protagonist's actions in a way that doesn't directly relate to them, which is something that we can sometimes forget to think about when we're so concerned with the protagonist. I do also want to acknowledge that, much like real newspapers, there is bias and propaganda present in some of these articles. Yes, it is a fictional publication, and it is sometimes impossible to know what the socio-political motivations are in publishing propaganda or biased material. But it does exist. Regardless of the reason why, it is there, and it does present itself in a few of these articles, which is why I bring it up. But anyway, the first issue of the game, though it doesn't necessarily provide us with any new information, is still pretty important. It's the first time that we can get our hands on a newspaper in-game and read about the world. It's establishing this world for us, the player, and for Arthur himself, as it's his first time in this part of the country. But all we really get from this issue is an article that really hounds the importance and influence of Leviticus Cornwall, which certainly comes up later in the story. But there's also a report on the front page about the infamous Blackwater ferry robbery. Now, most everything that we hear about this robbery is word of mouth, primarily from the gang itself. So this report is one of the first outside perspectives that we get to hear. Not only are we told that this is the biggest robbery in the region in recent history, we're also given a monetary amount of how much was stolen, $150,000. In today's number, this is over $5 million. Yeah, no wonder these guys were chased across 5 states. We also get some detail that the citizens of Blackwater are upset with the way that the Pinkertons are handling their investigation of this case by going around and upending people's homes to look for the criminals. It's not an important detail by any means, but I find it kind of funny that this just tells us that the Pinkertons don't ever succeed in anything but pissing people off. Honestly, this is just kind of how the first 10 issues of these papers go. Small blurbs that rehash a few past story missions from an outside reporting perspective. Oftentimes, we just don't get a lot of extra detail. The second issue comes after the train robbery in the mission Pouring Forth Oil, and gives us a witness testimony from a passenger on the affected train. Again, nothing new that we don't already know. It gives us some insight into how the NPCs react and are affected by the gang's presence. Although I will say there is a line on this report about the lawmen being tipped off about the robbery, which is interesting. A different article in this issue details the events of Sean Maguire's rescue by the gang. Really, it just gives us a little bit of insight into his personality by giving us a few quotes. Quote, "Maguire repeatedly expressed the idea of jail as no terror to him, nor the idea of death by hangman's noose. Maguire even once suggested to a sheriff that his rope wasn't stout enough and may break under his weight. What a trooper." Later in Chapter 3, the fourth newspaper issue, when recounting the drama between the gang, the Braithwaites, and the Greys thus far, gives us some context surrounding Rhodes itself, more specifically about the economic turmoil that Rhodes is facing. It states that wealthy landowners, such as the Greys and Braithwaites, have been on the wane since the war, and even gives us some commentary on the interminable feud between the two. Interestingly enough, this article also features a report on the events of the mission Blessed is the Meek, relaying the violent shootout in Strawberry. And wondering why in the hell they waited so long to report on this aside, we get somewhat of an insight on what impact that this had on the town, most specifically on the town's doctor. It's not until we get to Chapter 4 and complete the mission The Joys of Civilization that we get a report recounting the violent culmination of the drama between the gang, the Greys, and the Braithwaites. In this article, reporters relay the sort of panic and worry that the citizens of Rhodes and the surrounding area now have. Relatives of the families are concerned that violence might find them next. And although it's a smaller side column story, we also learned that the Valentine Bank robbery heralded by the gang has a report that, quote, believes that several $1,000s in cash, notes, and commercial papers were taken or destroyed. The sixth issue, which comes after the mission Urban Pleasures, doesn't give us new information as it relates to the main story. This issue also has a little blurb about the gang's old hideout at Clemens Point being found. I point this out because the article reports, quote, more people are involved in the thieving organization than officials pursuing the gang originally thought. And also because apparently locals are attributing attributing crimes like stolen cattle and missing daughters to the gang. Again, this relays to us how the NPCs and other characters in the world are impacted by the gang's presence. They are so scared of them that they're attributing crimes that they didn't even commit to them. Now, our next issue doesn't come until after the gang's return to America in Chapter 5. And it should come as no surprise that the big front page article is a report on the Lemoyne State Bank robbery. Now, since it's assumed that Arthur and the gang have been missing for at least a month at this point, we don't get to see the first big report right after the robbery occurs. Instead, we get this, which details the impact of the robbery long after it's happened. Outside of serving a grim reminder of the violence that took place here, we're given a supposed age for Hosea, the knowledge that the cleanup took several days, and the widespread belief that the gang had fled the country. Another front page article we can read is about the assassination of Alberto Fusar, which, like I prefaced at the beginning, serves as a great example of the propaganda that you can find in newspapers. Whether it's intentional or not, this most certainly communicates a very particular perspective. Fusar is spoken of very highly in this article, and his death is seen as a tragedy. Blatant lies are told about the sugar trade in order to make him seem more benevolent and kind-hearted than he really was. And we know this because we literally witness it in Warma. It's hard to say if the publishers were paid to say this, or if they report on him this way because it's what every other publication or every other person was talking about. And although this isn't necessarily part of the main story yet, I do want to point out that similar propaganda is spouted in an article that talks about Cornwall's proposed army contract. The whole article is so proud and encouraging. It paints Cornwall and his contract in a very positive light. And it's hard to say if this opportunity would actually be beneficial for citizens, but we all know that Cornwall isn't exactly the most altruistic person. The next few issues, all part of Chapter 6, don't really relay any new information to us, but I want to discuss the tone of these articles that discuss the main story missions. The 8th issue recounts the events of the mission Visiting Hours, and it does it in such a disingenuous way. It's so flowery and dramatic that it almost sounds fake. It describes some kind of riot that leaves both inmates and guards dead, and describes the inmates here as savage beasts. I find it particularly interesting that the entire article closes out with a quote saying that officials are still putting together an official number, which, you know, kind of makes me think that they're sort of trying to create narratives here. The next issue has an article on the assassination of Leviticus Cornwall, which quite honestly reads a lot like the report on Alberto Fusar. This paper kisses the ass of a capitalist who did more harm than good, and it's probably motivated by money. This same issue also has a report on the dynamite robbery that Bill and Arthur commit in Van Horn. The final paragraph assumes this robbery to be the fault of immigrants or a rogue gang of Indians. Obviously, we know that to be incorrect. And also kind of crazy considering any witness who would have seen this go down would have been able to tell that it was 2 white men committing this crime. Not to say immigrants can't be white, but I think it's kind of clear what message they're trying to purport here. This article speaks to the growing resentment and growing issue with the Native Americans that we see become very prevalent in Chapter 6. Now, let me be clear, the issue has existed a lot longer than the events of Chapter 6, and it unfortunately continues to exist after Chapter 6. But as it comes to the forefront and it intertwines with our story and the events that pertain to the protagonist, that sentiment seems to be reflected in these articles. Literally, the next issue, which is released after The King's Son, does the exact same thing. The language in this article is so derogatory and insulting towards Native Americans, treating them like some sort of problem that needs to be taken care of. Now, we don't get another newspaper release for 8 years when the epilogue comes around. And aside from a few setups for other storylines, there's really not a lot to cover in them. As in, there's nothing that really relates to our main story, like, at all. Now, to be fair, I actually think this makes a lot of sense. In the epilogue, John is trying his hardest to live this new, reformed, calmer lifestyle than he was living in 1899. While at one point he was going around robbing people in banks and causing a lot of problems and bringing violence everywhere he went, and there were people to then report on that violence, now, nobody cares about the new farmhand at the Getty's Ranch. Local local news is not going to report on some poor bastard that bought up Beecher's Hope and is bounty hunting to pay it off. So there's really nothing to cover until we get to the final issue. Issue number 14, released after the mission, American Venom, has the front page headline that we've all been waiting for. Micah Bell killed. Although that's very exciting to read, there's really not anything new in the actual article. It simply serves as a reminder of his terror and his brutality that he enacted on people, as well as the acknowledgement that despite all of the law enforcement that was chasing after him, it was a gang member who killed him, which certainly comes back up in our story and has a sort of Chekhov's gun moment. And that's where our main story ends. I don't necessarily dislike that these articles and reports don't feed us a lot of new information. Again, the reporters and lawmen that are writing these up and talking about them don't have as much detail as we do because they were not there when the crimes were committed. They just simply don't have the context we do to know why this happened or what the actual details of what went down were. All they do is manage to showcase the impact and the reaction of the people who live in the world around these events. It's easy to forget what the people around them might think when we ourselves are so concerned with the protagonist and the survival of this gang. But the violence that this gang commits has left the people who live here scared and afraid. Again, it's just a way to help make this world feel a little bit more real. Like, these aren't just NPCs that are walking around with no concern and no care for everything that the gang is doing. These are real people with real lives who are actually impacted by the violence and fear for their lives, fear for their safety, and don't know what's going on. Obviously, that's not true. These are fictional characters, they're pixels on a screen, but I like feeling like the random citizen number 25 in Saint Denis is a little bit more fleshed out than just being pixels. The last thing I considered covering in this video would have been all of the advertisements that adorn the pages because, as we all know, capitalism never sleeps. But I decided against it simply because I would love someday to do a deep dive on all of the businesses and how they are represented or all of the advertisements that they have for these businesses. So I didn't want to overlap. Now, whether or not I'm actually crazy enough to do that kind of remains to be seen. I have a feeling I will. But truth be told, a lot of the advertisements in the papers don't really tell us a lot. A lot of them repeat. A few of them are only there for some kind of like comic relief to say, hey, look, there's medicine for pinworms. But I think I've talked long enough. I did tell myself this video would be under an hour since my last two were much longer than I intended them to be. But despite it all, I do want to extend another thanks to everybody who has supported me. I really do appreciate. Thank you so much. I wish I could do this a little more often. It's just kind of hard with my schedule, but I appreciate everybody who stuck up with the weird kind of sporadic posting. I don't know if I should sneak peek what the next video idea is, but it's something that a lot of people have asked for when I proposed it, so keep your eye out for that. How do we feel about the new setup? I know I've changed it every video, but I can't make my mind up, and the lighting in this room sucks, so if I want to make my background look any kind of like cool and interesting and like not a blank wall, I have to kind of finagle a lot of things to make the lighting actually look good and like you can see me. My Labubu made it back. My Labubu and Manila made it back. Shout out if you know who Manila is. You're a real one if you know who Manila is. Anyways, I think I'm gonna head out. Like I always say, stay safe, take care of yourself, and I hope I will see you in the next video. Bye bye!